ونستعينه ونستهديه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. الحمد لله الذي قال في القرآن المجيد: لو أنزلنا هذا القرآن على جبل لرأيته خاشعا متصدعا من خشية الله. وقال تعالى في القرآن المجيد: الحمد لله الذي أنزل على عبده الكتاب ولم يجعل له عوجا. I feel like I'm back with some friends, so I don't know whether I should give a formal khutbah or just have a small chat with you. But I have prepared something to reflect upon a very fascinating and a very important hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, narrated by Abu Dawood in Kitab al-Adab, a book of habits, of good habits. And it has been the hadith has attracted a lot of attention, a lot of commentary, and I think it's worth reflecting on it in our times. It is particularly, as I shared with you, it is a reflection on the self and how one thinks about the self. Let me put on something. It's a reflection on how we think about the self, particularly identity. I mean, one doesn't have to look very far to think about how, questions of nation, ethnicity, even religion, civilizations actually tear the fabric of societies apart. Even at one time when we thought that Islam was a good way of uniting people, unfortunately we cannot say that with a straight face anymore. And when we thought maybe 25 years ago South Africa came out of apartheid and we are United Nations, and now you see people all conflicting with each other and basically preparing to die in that cause as such. On a deeper level, I mean, the question of authenticity, the question of the self as such, is deeply rooted in modern philosophy. So you have to be, you can be your own self, you are invited to discover yourself, so that yourself can be free. For example, you don't necessarily need to listen to family or traditions and things like that. That is quite deeply rooted in our modern understanding, modern philosophy of the self. And therefore, we think about authenticity. I mean, South Africa has Africa, to be African, this is our real authentic self. Or to be Muslim, for example. I mean, in the 1970s, the people like Biko and the Muslim Youth Movement actually were talking the same language, even though one was saying we should be Muslims and the other was saying no, we should be African. But I'm saying both of them are underlined by the fact of authenticity, about identity, which is different from the other. And I think that basically is questioned by this particular hadith, in the way, especially in the way that it has been interpreted, particularly by the Sufis, and in particular by Jalaluddin Rumi, which I would like to share with you today. So Jalaluddin Rumi basically has written a lot about the self, as you know. I'm sure many of you are familiar with reading maybe small excerpts of it. At one time, he became the most quoted poet, most quoted poet in English in America, I think in 2001 or 2. And he has been read for different kinds of reasons, and I don't want to speak about the differences today, but I was struck by one chapter of his in his book called Fihi Ma Fihi. It's a very, very interesting title. It just means that it is what is. It is it. It's a collection of apparently sermons or the khutbahs that he had collected, or that his students had collected, that he had given towards the end of his life. And it's considered to be a book that speaks about his philosophy of how he read the Quran, how he understood the world, how he understood creation. So in this particular khutbah, or at least what the translator calls discourse, Jalaluddin Rumi meditates on what is it, on the idea of estrangement, to be separated, to be somehow estranged, not to be necessarily together with another. Now, I think this is in itself quite interesting to begin with, because normally when we think about that we are all Muslims, or that we are South Africans, or we are all humans, we often think about the fact that we are same with each other. And Jalaluddin Rumi says, no, you're not the same. You actually have to start from the fact that you are different from each other. And he calls it estrangement, that you are actually separated from each other. So his idea is that we want to be separate from each other, we want to be different from each other, and so this is very much part of our life as such. So he wants to begin there. But the most interesting thing is that he doesn't only begin with the relationship between people, he speaks also about the relationship between human beings and God, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The self and Allah is also a relationship that is between the self and the other, in this case, the absolute other. He doesn't say too much about the relationship in this particular chapter, in this particular discourse on the relationship between himself and Allah, but I think it's worthwhile beginning there as he also begins. So he says the relationship between the self and Allah is a relationship of estrangement, which is reminiscent of, many of you may have recalled maybe one of his first, which is his most famous lines of poetry with which he begins the Mathnawi. I don't know if anybody remember that. It is about he says, listen to the reed. You know that? Listen to the reed, which is the sound that you listen to the reed is the longing of the reed for wanting to go back to where it was torn from the bank of the river. So when you create the reed, when you create a flute in order to sing, he says that when you are listening to that sound, it's a sound of longing, because it is an estrangement, because the reed was plucked away from the banks of the river, and now you can actually see it. Now he sees the relationship between human beings and God as this kind of an estrangement, which actually wants to go back. But then he immediately says, in this particular sense, that this kind of an estrangement that you have is actually marked by a lot of pain, because of the fact that God finds, first of all, that you are far away from God, but also he finds a lot of faults in you. You know, God is always telling us, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is always telling us, do this, don't do that you are this, you are just ungrateful. So it's kind of always, our relationship with Allah is that he's always blaming us for things as such. And Jalaluddin Rumi, basically, he thinks or he reflects on this, and then his response to that estrangement, or the response to this kind of separation between Allah and the human being, is he says, and I quote, "Love continues as long as reprimands continue," said the poet. "We may reprimand our friends, but we never reprimand a stranger." So just think about that. He's saying, first of all, this relationship is that of estrangement, and we have to somehow, I think Jalaluddin Rumi says, we have to somehow live with it, because God is always going to tell us that we are not quite up to the standard that which he made us for. But at the same time, he says, don't be despondent by that, because if God stops reprimanding you, through the Quran, through other people, through all kinds of things that you encounter yourself, that means God has actually forgotten about you. And when God forgets about you, basically then you are truly estranged. So with that kind of relationship, I mean, Jalaluddin Rumi just stops there, and he just doesn't expand a little bit more, but he just says that this estrangement especially with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, has to continue, because if it doesn't continue, that means God is not really concerned about you anymore. And so therefore that will be the true, that separation as such. So I feel that perhaps that's already is already indicating to us how we should think about, our relationship with others, not as a relationship of permanent sameness where we submerge our differences, but rather that we see our differences as opportunities for much more greater reflection as such. Then he goes on, and he speaks about, and he tackles specifically, it pays attention to the relationship between humans that humans have with each other, which is also an estrangement, which also begins with an estrangement. And Jalaluddin Rumi basically shares three, what I consider, I've divided these, he sort of writes it in a kind of poetic, in this case it's a kind of there's fihi mafu is not poetry, but it's a kind of a rhyming prose. So I've decided to sort of analyze it a little bit more. And I identify three different points that he sort of brings up as such, and I would like to share with you and conclude the khutbah. Let me begin with his quote, in a sense. If you find fault in your brother or sister, the fault you see in them is within yourself. The true self is like a mirror where you see your own image. And then he quotes the hadith, the believer is a mirror of their fellow believers. Get rid of those faults in yourself, because what bothers you in them bothers you in yourself. So you can see, rather than the hadith, which is often interpreted to mean that you are a mirror to the other, because you have the capacity to correct somebody else. Because when you have a very close brother, the best thing that you expect from the person is to correct you when you're doing wrong. And that's kind of an admonishment that generally is accepted. I mean, is accepted as an interpretation. Jalaluddin Rumi turns this thing around. He says, no. He says, if you find fault in somebody else, the fault you see in them is within yourself. It turns the whole thing around. Rather than seeing, when you see somebody else's fault, because it's a mirror, what you are seeing, you're seeing yourself actually. You're not seeing the other person. So you have to recognize that when you see the other person, especially the other person's fault, you are actually seeing the faults in yourself. So that's the first movement that he makes about how to basically think about one's relationship with the other. Then he gives us another metaphor, which is a slightly different metaphor, and then I quote him again. An elephant was led to a well to drink. Seeing itself in the water, it shied away. It thought it was shying away from another elephant. It did not realize it was shying away from its own self. So this is a slightly different metaphor, and Jalaluddin Rumi is famous for doing that. He moves from one metaphor for another, always to sort of circling around and to make sure that if you didn't understand this one part, let me give it to you from a different side. In this one, he tells us about an elephant which sees its own reflection in the water and thinks that it is another elephant. Obviously, we know, standing outside, that it is not another elephant, it is the same. But it is this illusion of the self and the other that Jalaluddin Rumi wants to present. So I think what he's trying to say here is that sometimes when we turn away from, especially when you are looking at the mirror and you're turning away from another person, you think it is somebody else. We think in this case it is another elephant, but you should actually think it is yourself again. So in the first case, he basically says you should think of yourself separately, but in this case he said the illusion, that the idea that we are all different is just an illusion, and so therefore you need to overcome the illusion. You need to be like the elephant, or you need to be like the observer of the elephant, who's realizing that the elephant is not turning away from another, but is turning away from their own self. And I think there's much more work that can go through. The third point that Jalaluddin Rumi takes us to, it's all around the same text of the Prophet's statements about believers being mirrors of the other. All evil qualities, and I quote him again, oppression, hatred, envy, greed, mercilessness, pride, when they are within yourself, they bring no pain. You shy away and feel the pain when you see them in other. And I think this is a third point as such, very, very important, very significant, and it can be quite daunting to actually begin to think about this. He's saying that if you see oppression, all evil qualities, when they are in oneself, that means oppression, hatred, envy, greed, when they are part of oneself, when we have those qualities, we don't necessarily feel any trouble with them. We perhaps don't even see them as such, but we see them very quickly in another person. We see these qualities much easier in another person because of the fact that we recognize what these qualities are. We recognize that these are not good qualities, but you cannot actually see them yourself. Let us go again. Now it goes on, and Jalaluddin Rumi again is famous for actually using some very, very concrete and very, very tangible kind of metaphors in order to describe what he says. We feel no disgust at our own scab and abscess. We will dip our infected hand into our food and lick our fingers without turning in the least bit squeamish. Maybe we won't do that because we know about COVID-19 and all things like that, or we know about bacteria. But let us accept his metaphor a little bit more. And he continues, but if we see a tiny abscess or half a scratch on another's hand, we shy away from that person's food and have no stomach for it whatsoever. Evil qualities are just like scabs and abscesses. When they are within us, they cause no pain. But when we see them to a small degree in another, then we feel pain and disgust. And this, I think, I cannot put it any clearer than what he is saying about how one recognizes, qualities in another that you don't often see in yourself. Just as you shy away from your brother or sister, you should excuse them for shying away from you. The pain you feel comes from those faults, and they see the same faults. The seeker of truth is a mirror for the neighbors, but those who cannot feel the sting of truth are not mirrors to anyone but themselves. So he continues to describe this kind of quality that we are basically, ideally, I think he is then coming to a conclusion that we actually need somebody else in order to see us. So on the one hand, we recognize our faults because we recognize we're seeing them in the other, but we have to recognize they are not the other's faults, but they're actually our own faults. But without those faults, he says this last phrase of his, which I think is very valuable. He says, but those who cannot feel the sting of truth, who cannot feel the sting of this truth, are not mirrors to anyone but themselves. So they don't necessarily have the opportunity of seeing this, this kind of the true nature of the self, if they don't necessarily, if not prepared to see the mirror of themselves. So I think in conclusion then, I think that Jalaluddin Rumi's meditation on this, very profound hadith as such, which, before I read this, I actually only thought of it as, this is a fundamental tradition of Islam, which means that you have to correct somebody else. You have to be prepared to do that. In Amr bil Ma'ruf is actually a very strong tradition. I don't want to necessarily deny that it is not there and that it is not an important part of the tradition. But Jalaluddin Rumi doesn't tell us not to do that, but he still takes us to another step a little bit before that. A little bit about not necessarily of what one does for the other, but what can you do for yourself in this case as such. And when you are correcting this, we always think, if you're pointing a finger to somebody, 3 fingers are pointing at you. But I think Jalaluddin Rumi's reflection on the self and the other as a mirror brings out much more profound sense of what it actually means to be in a society, how it means to be relating to other people as such. And he's not necessarily saying that you give up your differences and your uniqueness as such, but you can only use, especially people who are different from you, whether they are Donald Trump or the local imam or the local priest that you don't like, or your neighbor, for example. It's a relationship that actually challenges you, especially because when there's a conflict, and then you use that as an opportunity to self-reflect, to reflect on oneself again. I think when I wrote this article, which Yusuf has kindly agreed to reprint here, I was actually writing on the question of Muslim education. I thought Muslim education at that time, a couple of years ago, we were asked by IIIT to reflect on the project that they were starting, Islamic education. And I brought this idea because I thought there's so much of emphasis in Islamic education on identity formation, on the fact that we all have to be different from the others. South Africans must be different, or Muslims must be different from others. But we've very rarely given some reflection on what does it mean for each one of us individually as well. What is the self meaning for us as such? And I think that the reflections that we have in the intellectual history of Islam, like Jalaluddin Rumi's, give us a lot of thought for reflection as such. And finally, I think that I also wanted to show you this. This is a very literal interpretation. It takes the hadith of the Prophet, it takes it on the basis of a mirror. What is a mirror? And it turns it around and thinks more about what does it mean that the prophetic hadith or the Prophet ﷺ used the mirror as a reflection of the self. And the Sufis and other scholars have thought about this for a long time. You can see it's not necessarily an esoteric interpretation. It's not a deep, it is a deep interpretation, but it also reflects more carefully on what is actually being said here. And so sometimes we need to pause a little bit on these metaphors, pause on these words, so that we can begin to think about the literalness of the Quran, or in the different ways it can be interpreted. Interpretation doesn't necessarily need to go away from the text. It actually goes deeper in the text as such. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروا إنه الغفور الرحيم. الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونستهديه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهد الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد اتقوا الله يرحمكم الله. The second khutbah is also to an opportunity to reflect a little bit on what it means, or what it on the consciousness of Allah, on the fear of Allah. I think I dedicated the first khutbah also to that, but I wanted to just return again just on one or two sentences about this, the self that actually plays such an important role in the tradition, in Islamic tradition, and that one sometimes tends to forget it as such a little bit. So I hope that this can be a sense of a sort of advice or a kind of a recommendation, not only for yourself but for me as well. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept our reflections and our considerations of this as such. We also turn in the second khutbah to making dua, especially for those in our communities who have passed away since in the last 2 years or so during COVID, friends and families who have passed away. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant them قال تعالى في القرآن المجيد إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وأصحابه وبارك وسلم اللهم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا أو أخطأنا ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتوب علينا يا مولانا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم اللهم اغفر لحينا وميتنا وشاهدنا وغائمنا وصغيرنا وكبيرنا وذكرنا وأنثانا اللهم من أحييته منا فأحيي على الإسلام ومن توفيته منا فتوفه على الإيمان اللهم ربنا اغفر لنا ولوالدينا ولأساتذتنا ولجميع المؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء منهم والأموات برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين قال الله تعالى في القرآن المجيد إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون ولذكر الله أكبر والله يعلم ما تصنعون أقيموا الصلاة